Welcome. I'm Kerry Colonisi, the director of the Penn Program on Regulation, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you today to our lecture by my most distinguished and valued colleague, Professor Anita Allen. Today's lecture represents the continuation of the Penn Program on Regulation's year-long lecture series on race and regulation. It's our first such lecture in the series for the new calendar year and the new semester, with 4 more lectures to follow in the weeks ahead. This lecture series is dedicated to exploring the most important responsibility of any society, ensuring equal justice and dignity and respect to all people. We're looking both at ways that law and regulation have contributed to inequality, injustice, and structural racism, as well as ways that law and regulation can help counteract injustices and advance the cause of racial equity. Today's lecture is special to me because it features another distinguished colleague from Penn Law, Professor Allen. An earlier lecture in the fall was delivered by another one of our colleagues, Professor Dorothy Roberts. And today's lecture will also be followed by commentary by one of our most thoughtful colleagues and thought leaders at Penn's School of Social Policy and Practice, Professor Dixon Roman. And if that weren't itself enough, this particular lecture today is also being co-sponsored by the Center for Technology Innovation and Competition at Penn Law, also known as CTIC. CTIC and its faculty are working at the cutting edge of the most vital issues related to law and technology, including the kinds of privacy issues which will be the focus of today's lecture. I'm truly delighted that the Penn Program on Regulation could partner again with CTIC on an event of such great public interest like this one today. It's a hallmark of Penn as an institution and of the interdisciplinary and collegial environment of Penn Law in particular that such collaborations are so frequently possible and easily facilitated. Of course, I want to thank the outstanding staff at CTIC, especially Caroline Olson, as well as Andy Coopersmith at PPR and Carlin Miller and Anna Gavin at the law school's events team for making this possible. And of course, to facilitate such a collaborative event, it also helps that the founder and director of CTIC is himself so collegial, interdisciplinary, and welcoming, in addition to being one of the world's most foremost authorities on law and technology, including issues of antitrust, privacy, and other facets of regulating new technologies. It's my distinct privilege and honor to introduce CTIC's director, Christopher Yu, the John H. Chestnut Professor of Law, Communication, and Computer and Information Science. I'm very pleased that Professor Yu will serve as the moderator of today's session, offering formal introductions of our speakers and moderating the question and answer period. Professor Yu?
Well, thank you very much, Professor Colonisi. As you said, this is another opportunity for CTIC to partner with the Penn Program on Regulation. We are delighted to do that, and I think it's a sign of the collegiality that is typical and the interdisciplinarity that characterizes the University of Pennsylvania Law School and the University of Pennsylvania more generally. This is also part of our ongoing series on hot topics in law and technology, which we hold every month. It was wonderful to have the opportunity where both I and Kerry, Professor Colonisi, had the same idea of the ideal participant to present path-breaking work in the questions of race and privacy that bring us all together here today. But before I go into the details of that, a few housekeeping notes. I want to make sure that everyone in the audience is aware that we are recording this webinar and we'll be posting it to both the CTIC and Penn Program on Regulation's YouTube channels. Closed captioning is available for anyone who would like it, provided by Zoom without any warranties on its accuracy. We also have a short amount of time set at the end for question and answers. We apologize in advance if we are unable to get to all of them, but there is a Q&A function you will see at the bottom of your screen. You should feel free to submit a question anytime, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible at the end of the event. We do ask that you keep your questions topical and appropriate, and bear in mind that we reserve the right to remove any questions that do not satisfy those standards. Lastly, for those seeking CLE credit, we will give out 3 passcodes through the poll function in Zoom through the course of the event. The first one is appearing on your screen right now. These will have to be entered, write them down and entered on your CLE evaluation form in order to receive proper credit for them. So with the housekeeping matters out of the way, it is my pleasure to proceed to the most important part of our today's event, which is to open the substantive program, for which we have 2 fantastic speakers, which I will each introduce immediately before they speak. So with apologies or with the understanding of Professor Dixon Roman, I will only introduce Professor Allen right now, and we'll save the wonderful introduction I have for him until later. Professor Anita Allen is my dear colleague here at the University of Pennsylvania and is the Henry R. Silverman Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy. She just returned after having served the university as a whole as Vice Provost for Faculty from 2013 to 2020, which is she did fantastic work on issues of diversity and inclusion at the faculty level for the entire university, and in fact did fantastic service. And we are grateful to welcome her back into the law school full time with our gratitude both for her service and for what she is doing for Penn Law now. What's quite interesting to me is privacy has become such a hot topic that it's almost hard to remember that there was a time when this field wasn't really regarded as that hot. It was a small, specialized field that was thought of as relatively obscure, and that only a few visionary scholars saw the future and the potential of what it could be and what it really meant to American people. And Anita Allen is one of those visionaries. She moved into this field long before it was considered hot and before it was recognized, people fully understood the full power of the fact of other people possessing people's personal information can have over their lives and over particularly such issues as gender and race in a way that I think very few people, that can be said about very few other people. And I think the accolades she's received really reflect this. She is an elected member of not just in law of the American Law Institute, but also of the National Academy of Medicine, and also is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is one of those transcendent institutions which covers many disciplines. She's also received a wealth of honors, including the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Electronic Privacy Information Center, where she is currently serving as an officer and has served as a term as a chair of its board of directors. Last year, she received the American Philosophical Association's 2021 Philip L. Quinn Prize, which is the APA's highest honor for service to the profession. And she is about to receive the 2022 Privacy Award from the Berkeley Law and Technology Center for Law and Technology. At the risk of giving short shrift to the other honors, I will stop there, but I could continue. And I will say it only serves to prove just how fortunate we are to have her with us today to present what is new work that has never been presented before on dismantling the Black Opticon, race, equity, and online privacy and data protection reform, which is forthcoming in the Yale Law Journal and is available on SSRN for those who would like to see the full draft. But instead of that, I will turn it over to you, Anita, and Professor Allen, to take us through and introduce us to your fascinating and path-breaking work.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Yu. I really appreciate what you and Professor Cognizzi have done to make it possible for me to present this new work. I'm going to go to screen share and put up my slides and we can get right into the thick of things. So I've been, as Christopher, you intimated, I've been a privacy scholar and advocate for over 35 years. And until very recently, neither scholars nor advocates of any race sustained a focus on race-specific issues. Very few people were addressing them using the tools of, say, conventional civil rights theory or economic theory, and very few even using the tools of critical race theory, such as interest conversion analysis, structural institutional racism analysis, or power dynamic critiques. But through the contributions of Black and Brown scholars, such as Kiara Bridges and Simone Brown, Andrew Brock Jr., Devin Cabardo, and Latanya Sweeney, and groups like Color of Change, Algorithmic Justice League, ACLU, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, a Legal Defense Fund, and the Brookings Institution, too. So all of these collaborative and individual exercises and studies, we have now come to understand that looking at privacy through a racial lens makes a big difference. It magnifies the consequences of what Shoshana Zuboff labels surveillance capitalism, what Frank Pasquale has termed the darker narrative of platform capitalism, what Angela Harris and Nancy Leong have described as racial capitalism. For want of racially diverse lenses, the story of Black Americans' privacy has been under-narrated. And toward that amelioration of that fact, I'm going to be focusing this afternoon on the discriminatory online treatment of African Americans with respect to their data privacy and data protection. In other work that I'm engaged in right now, I'm focusing on other dimensions of this under-narrated story, and I look forward to sharing that with you another time. Before proceeding, I need to thank a few people. I want to thank the Yale Law Journal, the Yale Information Society Project White Paper Series, and the Knight Foundation. I want to thank them for soliciting and supporting the essay on which this race-focused talk today is based. It will be published in the Yale Law Journal Forum and on the ISP website on February the 20th, and I hope you'll check it out at that time. Online platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google, Airbnb, Uber, Amazon, Apple, TikTok, Microsoft have created attractive opportunities and efficiencies. We know that. Yet these platforms come at a heavy price. Familiar platforms collect, use, analyze, and share massive amounts of personal data. They're motivated by profit with very little accountability and transparency. The social cost of information privacy diminution include discrimination, misinformation, and political manipulation. The self-governance efforts of big tech companies have not silenced the criticism that platform firms prioritize free speech, interconnectivity, and interoperability at the expense of equitable privacy protections and anti-racist measures. New rules, statutes, and authorities are needed, in my opinion. From the ash heap of World War II, privacy emerged as a human right. Look at all the UN documents, the declarations of human rights, covenants on human rights, they all mention privacy as a fundamental human right. But recently, Americans have come to think of privacy as a human right, is also a civil right. And a new generation of privacy and data protection laws are evolving that consciously recognize the civil rights dimension of privacy. These state and local and federal laws do require a hard look to determine whether they go far enough toward addressing the digital age vulnerabilities of African Americans. But what are those vulnerabilities? Well, until I undertook this project, I'm going to tell you, I didn't have a clue, and I don't think anybody really understood well how we could succinctly say exactly what the vulnerabilities of African American people are. But today I'm prepared to offer a novel privacy and data protection framework for encapsulating the online vulnerabilities of African Americans. and I call it the Black Opticon. In using the expression Black Opticon, I'm clearly echoing the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. In 1791, long time ago, in 1791, Bentham popularized the idea of the panopticon that became, by 1971, a popular metaphor for digital life. African Americans dwell under the attentive eye of a Black Opticon, a threefold system of social disadvantage comprised of discriminatory surveillance, what I call the panopticon, exclusion, what Didier Bigot would call the banopticon, and predation, which I dub the conopticon to insinuate the ideas of scams and frauds and that sort of thing. As I will shortly explain, the Black Opticon metaphor encapsulates literal aspects of the urgent privacy and data protection problems facing African Americans. So, how much do African Americans even use the internet? How much are they on platforms? Answer: a lot. African Americans are active users of online platforms. Black Americans turn to the internet for all kinds of things: communication, housing, education, business, employment, loans, government services, health services, and recreation. And although a whopping 30% of Black households do not have a high-speed internet, and a significant percentage of Black homes don't have a personal computer, Black Americans are well represented among the 400 million users of Twitter and the billions of daily users of Meta, now formerly Facebook. African Americans accounted for nearly 1/10, I was amazed by this, 1/10 of all the Amazon retail spending in the US in 2020. African Americans who are active online participants could greatly benefit from well-designed and I would say race-conscious efforts to shape a more equitable digital public through improved laws and legislation. A new generation of privacy laws would ideally include provisions specifically geared towards combating privacy and data protection-related racial inequalities enabled by online platforms. American lawmakers should focus on the experiences of marginalized populations, no less than other populations, than privileged populations. To move from generic to race-conscious reform, I'm going to propose a specific set of policymaking imperatives that I call an African American online equity agenda. I'll just usually refer to it as my agenda, but the formal name that I'm giving it is African American Online Equity Agenda. And this agenda should inform legal institutional initiatives towards ending African Americans' heightened vulnerability to discriminatory over-surveillance, exclusion, and targeting. Let's dispense right away with the notion that Black people don't care about privacy. It's just simply not true. I think that what is true is that Black Americans often can't afford the technology that comes with the most data protection built in. They can't afford the iPhone. They can't afford the encryption. So they get the Android phone with the crappy privacy protections. In addition to that, like everybody else, Black people are challenged by the terms of service and privacy policies that are lengthy, technical, and complex. Even those educated people have trouble dealing with exactly what their rights are and what their responsibilities might be when it comes to data protection on online platforms. Let me share with you an illustrative example of each of the three types of problem that I call the banopticon, conopticon, and panopticon, the Black Opticon altogether. Let me just share with you the example, just to give you an example of each one. For the panoptic, I'll give an example using the Geophilia incident. For banoptic, I'll give you an example using from Facebook's housing discrimination problems. And for the conoptic, I'll give you an example involving an online litigation involving mylife.com. So let's start with the over surveillance, the panoptic problem. So long time before there was ever critical race theory, legal sociologist Alan Weston, in his 1964 mega influential treatise, Privacy and Freedom, noted the special susceptibility of African Americans to the panoptic threat. So interesting that at the beginning of privacy scholarship, the special vulnerability of African Americans was recognized. Western explicitly mentioned African Americans in relation to concerns over covert physical and surveillance and discrimination by segregationists within what he called a white power structure. Similarly, Harvard professor Arthur Miller raised political surveillance as a privacy problem facing African Americans in his landmark 1971 book, Assault on Privacy. And attorney Michael Meyer, in his 1972 book, Rights of Privacy, decried the unlawful wiretapping surveillance of Martin Luther King that was revealed in the trial of Muhammad Ali. Mayer also devoted a short chapter to the problems of over-surveillance of the poor who are dependent upon government welfare for housing and other benefits, foreshadowing Kiara Bridges' important work on the poverty of privacy. So here's a geophilia example. In 2016, the ACL reported that police departments were using software purchased from Geophilia, which is a location analytics software company. Following the Black Lives protest in Baltimore that was sparked by the death of African-American Freddie Gray while in police custody, Baltimore police reportedly used Geophilia software to track down and arrest peaceful protesters with outstanding warrants. The police deliberately focused arrest intimidation within majority Black communities, such as especially Sandtown, Winchester, the precinct where Freddie Gray was apprehended and killed. The software that Geophilia and the police used relied upon social media posts and facial recognition technology to identify protesters. How'd they get the data? Well, they got it from Twitter, they got it from Facebook, they got it from Instagram, and 9 other social media companies. When there was a public outcry, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram backed off and discontinued, but Geophilia continued to market its services at a time when the FBI was a client of theirs, and the FBI reported an interest in so-called Black identity extremists as a movement. And they felt it was important to be able to target, identify members of this movement. But the way they defined that Black extremist was so broad that a person just out on a Sunday stroll as part of a protest might be deemed a Black identity extremist. It was a problem. All right, so that's one example of how African Americans are under the attentive eye of the Black Opticon. Second example is in the category of the banoptic discrimination or the exclusion discrimination. And this one involves discriminatory exclusion that obtains information from Black people to disadvantage them, to exclude them from something that white people and other races might have access to. So for a time, Facebook allowed advertisers to choose by race which Facebook users could and could not see their advertisements. This ability to target sectors of the market meant that African Americans could be excluded from commercial opportunities on the basis of their race alone. Now, Facebook claimed at one point to have fixed the problem, devising a system that would recognize and not post discriminatory housing advertisements. And yet, in 2017, journalists at ProPublica were able to purchase housing advertisements that were designed as a test to exclude African Americans and people needing wheelchairs in violation of the Fair Housing Act. The authorities caught on, and 2 years later, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development actually charged Facebook with violating the Fair Housing Act, and Facebook faced considerable damages. Well, Facebook now firmly and strongly, by its policies, prohibits discrimination based on race, at least officially. Last example in the category of the conoptic discrimination. So this is the third dimension, and this involves using personal data to target people of color for the purposes of including them, but including them in opportunities that are exploitative or scams or con jobs where they would prefer not to be excluded, actually. So this is predation, selling and marketing products that don't work, extending payday loans with exploitative terms, selling products like magazines that are never delivered. They do this especially to people with folks in prison. They pretend to sell their magazines that they never get to the guys in prison. And also there are various illusory money-making schemes that are targeted to populations, not just Black people, by the way, also Hispanics are targets of this. But these are deliberate efforts to take advantage of the special vulnerabilities of people of color and marginalized people. So recent litigation focused on a company called MyLife.com. So MyLife.com is an online enterprise that sells profiles of individuals marketed for purposes of including purposes that would include things like housing, credit, employment screening, decisions about those kinds of things. So screening services. Well, these services are particularly important to people of color who have limited income, weak credit, maybe criminal justice backgrounds and histories that are barriers to obtaining necessities. So they're tempted to use the services of such companies in order to find out sort of where they stand in the world. One thing the company was doing was to target Black people with the fear that the perception that there was criminal information about them that was available to other people, and Black people should sign up for additional services in order to be able to monitor and track exactly what this criminal history was, when in fact there was no criminal history, or there was history of a parking ticket or something of that nature. In any event, so the Fair Credit Reporting Act does address problems like this, and in a very important lawsuit brought by the FTC and the Department of Justice, alleging that MyLife.com violated the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the company was in fact found responsible for violations for failing to maintain reasonable procedures to verify, for example, how its reports are used, to ensure the information is accurate, and to make sure information was, if it was sold, it would be used by third parties only for legitimate purposes. Well, the suit resulted in an injunction and a very large $21 million civil penalty for MyLife.com. Wow. So, Black Opticon pays the wrong kind of attention to African Americans, using the resources of internet platforms and other digital technologies to gather, process, and share data about who we are, where we are, and what our vulnerabilities are that make us receptive. Calls for improved platform governance flow from many sources. Self-regulation by big tech itself just isn't enough. The advocacy group Color of Change aptly credits itself with persuading Google to ban predatory lending apps from Google Play to protect Black people from unreasonable terms, high default rates, and manipulation. And also, just by the way, the Color of Change was able to get Pinterest to stop featuring plantation, wedding, and party venues that implicitly glorify the heinous slave economy. Well, these kind of successful interventions are lovely, but there are few and far of them. And I think a lot of this kind of stuff goes below the radar screen of some of our national advocacy groups. Changes in the design and enforcement of privacy law potentially help combat the Black Opticon. Legislative reform is certainly in the mix of proposed solutions, along with data trust, content moderation, social media councils, and other such approaches. Regimes of law, like antitrust law, intellectual property law, constitutional law, civil rights law, human rights law, they all bear on platform governance. But my point today is to urge that privacy and data protection law, legal measures are also important as requirements of adequate platform governance. And the measures that I think are needed would have to be race conscious, would ideally be race conscious. In addition to considering agendas that concern the general population, which are appropriate and foster strategic coalitions among different groups, policymakers should also welcome and rely upon group-specific anti-racist agendas for guidance. They should articulate race-based rationales for reform measures intended to protect group and group data privacy. This dual approach that I advocate, I call it sort of policymaking for all and policymaking for some, for all and for some, it helps to ensure that the interests of marginalized racial minorities are not overlooked and aids in surfacing possible conflicts between the interests of one racialized group and other groups. For example, targeting Black men for high-tech modes of data surveillance based on race may address concerns of a majority about freedom from crime, but violate Black men's entitlement to freedom and privacy from racist social control. So I'm going to be offering a rubric for assessing whether recent and pending law reform helps African Americans engage in the Black Opticon. This African American equity agenda that I'm going to be proposing is what we would offer lawmakers to help them think clearly about whether or not the laws that they're contemplating actually would satisfy the demands of the Black Opticon and the needs of the African American community. There should be goals of racial inequality non-exaggeration, racial impact neutrality, race-based discrimination over surveillance elimination, race-based discriminatory exclusion reduction, and race-based discriminatory fraud, deceit, and exploitation reduction. The last three are simply be aware of the Black Opticon and try in your lawmaking to address it. The first two I'll say a little bit more about because they're a little bit less obvious from the slide alone. But the racial inequality non-exacerbation goal says, let's design privacy and data protection policies that recognize that baseline data privacy and the power that data privacy confer may be unequally distributed among racial lines in our society, and that racial inequality should not be exacerbated. And then the racial impact neutrality goal says, let's design privacy and data protection policies, acknowledging that ostensibly race-neutral privacy policies may not have race-neutral effects or protect all groups equally. So that's the agenda. That's what we want to have policymakers keep in mind as they make law. So let's think about those goals in relationship to three recently proposed and enacted measures. The Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act of 2001, expanded Federal Trade Commission resources, and a Data Privacy Act, a bill introduced in Congress that would create a new federal data protection agency. Let's start with the Virginia statute. Now, I know for the non-lawyers in the room, it may be a little tedious and boring to go through the details of the statute. So I'm going to give you a short version of what the statute has to say and just point out a couple of things that I think are concerning from the point of view of the Black Opticon. First of all, it's important to know that Virginia is not alone in enacting a privacy statute. Colorado and California also enacted statutes, California a couple of years ago, Colorado this past summer. But the Virginia statute is particularly interesting and important from the point of view of the Black Opticon. And why is that? It's because Virginia is the only state of the three that was a part of the Confederacy. And because 21% of Virginians are African Americans. And because about 16% of Virginians live in poverty and are vulnerable to financial exploitation and abuses. And because 15% of Virginia Black adults did not graduate from high school, and only 21% of Black Virginians hold a college degree, which is the lowest percentage for any racial minority group or ethnic group that is reported in the state. So discriminatory credit, employment, educational and financial decisions are likely commonplace experiences for African Americans in Virginia, as they are for elsewhere in the nation. Another feature about Virginia's statute that makes it kind of interesting is that the main sponsor, or they call him the chief patron in Virginia, the chief patron of the statute was a man named Cliff Hayes, an African American who was also a former public sector information technology professional and a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. So he sponsored the legislation. His co-sponsor was a white man named David Marston in the Virginia Senate. But in the House of Delegates, there were several co-sponsors of the bill. They were called chief co-patrons in the rubric of the state. And these co-patrons included three who were people of color: one African American, one South Asian American, and one mixed race woman. So what is this statute, which was born in a state that belonged to the Confederacy, that was put forward by African Americans? What does it say? How does it do when measured against the equity agenda that I'm proposing? Well, here's the thing. Here's what the statute is like. It's not a civil rights law by any means, but it is a statute that tries to enact fair information practices that are applicable to businesses of all sorts in Virginia on behalf of Virginia consumers. Big tech firms like Microsoft and Amazon fully endorsed the statute, which ought to give us pause. Why would Microsoft and Amazon like this statute? The privacy group, Future of Privacy Forum, on whose board I joined a couple of weeks ago. This organization supported the bill as a significant milestone. Now, Future of Privacy Forum is supported in part by Facebook, Google, and Twitter. But many critics have described the Virginia law as weak and even empty, So the positive features of the law is that it does prohibit the processing of personal data in violation of state and federal anti-discrimination laws. That's a good thing. It also prohibits providing goods and services on a discriminatory basis when it comes to prices and services, which is another good thing. But there are a number of concerning features about the Virginia statute. There are numerous exemptions. Many types of organizations and entities are not covered by the statute. That includes state and local government, nonprofits, schools, and any kind of data that might be covered by federal statute like HIPAA. So why all these exemptions? Well, the fact that there are all these exemptions means that the statute is less able to be of use to addressing the Black Opticon. It exempts, for example, government entities, so it doesn't address the threat of law enforcement or public agency over surveillance, monitoring, tracking, profile, or identification. Photographs and data based on photographs commonly used for facial recognition analytics are excluded from the definition of biometrics in this statute. And while the use of photographic data has a place in law enforcement, machine and human errors in the use of such data disproportionately impact African Americans. Also, the statute allows targeting advertising. You have to opt out if you don't want that. Well, we know about opt-out complications. It's very difficult for consumers to opt out, especially when they're not aided by the companies to opt out by being informed as to what the reasons for opting out might be and how the process for opt-out works. Consumers can be charged a higher price if they opt out of targeted ads, profiling, and the sale of their data. And then another feature is that race is presumptively sensitive under the statute. Now you might think, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? Race is treated as special and sensitive information when it comes to data processing. I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, we don't want race to be used in a way that encourages or enables discrimination. On the other hand, we're not Europe, and we've never, as a country, had the European approach that treated race along with trade union membership as sensitive data. And I'm afraid, and many people are saying that they're afraid as well, that these statutes might end up, like Virginia's, might end up making it difficult to do affirmative action to benefit minority groups who need the kind of attention that affirmative action confers in education, employment, and in health services. On the other hand, the statute does exempt educational institutions from the coverage of the statute. So maybe we don't have to worry about that problem quite as much. But anyway, this is something to focus on, the fact that race is treated as a sensitive matter. Now, people can opt out of that protection if they want to, which is also a little bit strange. If it's such a sensitive matter, why do you let people opt out of it? If it's important, why do you get to opt out of it? And then finally, a lot of people think that it's a big problem with the statute that it doesn't provide for a private right of action. If you feel you've been harmed and you want to sue, you have to rely upon the Attorney General. Well, the Trial Lawyers Association of Virginia didn't like this part of the statute. And of course, they do have a self-interest here because they would like to be able to make money by bringing lawsuits. But they make a good point about the fact that in a state that has a history of being part of the Confederacy, for example, and where racism still pervades in many sectors, it may be a problem that Black people are left to the political whims of the day in terms of whether or not the Attorney General will take up their causes and pursue their cases. So it might be better to have a private cause of action. So this statute, which is, it is a landmark, it isn't clearly giving us what we need. It's promising, but in certain ways, disappointing. All right, Federal Trade Commission. What's happening there is quite interesting in that terrain. So As Daniel Solove and Woody Herzog have observed, the FTC privacy jurisprudence has become the broadest and most influential regulating force on information privacy in the United States. The FTC does not have a great track record of pursuing enforcement actions against platforms whose unfair or deceptive business practices target consumers belonging to marginalized communities like African Americans. They have gone after, though, Twitter, Google, Facebook, Snapchat, Ashley Madison. They've done all that. But I think that there's potential for the FTC to really focus on people of color. And they could, and they may, because of a confluence of three things. One, continued diverse leadership. Two, dedicated funding for a privacy bureau. And three, they've got a commitment already to addressing the problems of communities of color as a strategic priority. So in terms of diverse leadership, President Biden last September appointed a man of color, Alvaro Bedoya, to serve as one of the commissioners of the FTC. It's commissioner of the FTC. He was the founding director of the Center for Privacy and Technology at Georgetown University and a former chief counsel of the U.S. Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law. He's an immigrant from Peru and a naturalized U.S. citizen. I believe that Mr. Bedoya has a demonstrated understanding of the problems of racial minority targeting surveillance. His expertise could increase the effectiveness of the FTC in identifying privacy concerns, setting priorities, and enforcing privacy laws. Second thing is that there's this great new possible source of funding. Last September as well, the U.S. House Committee on Energy and Commerce voted to appropriate $1 billion to create and operate a bureau to accomplish the work of the commission related to unfair and deceptive practices related to privacy, data security, identity theft, data abuses, and related matters. This bureau's mandate to address data abuses might well signal that they're going to be able to handle the kind of abuses that are experienced by African Americans. And so hopefully, in line with my recommended online equity agenda, the FTC would, with this new funding, be able to be even more aggressive when it comes to people of color issues. The FTC does already have a race-conscious anti-discrimination agenda that could be pivoted to more focus on online equity for African Americans and other people of color. They at least released a report in 2016 called Combating Fraud in African American and Latino Communities, the FTC's comprehensive strategic plan, which reported on the outcomes of strategies to reduce fraud in Black and Latino communities. And very recently, in 2021, they issued another report called Serving Communities of Color, which described the Commission's strides in addressing fraud in Black and Latino communities and expanded efforts to include other communities of color, such as Asian Americans and Native American communities, and other non-fraud related consumer issues that also disproportionately affect communities of color. So, plaudits to the FTC for its recent efforts at delineating harms to communities of color. And from the point of view of the African American online equity agenda, the next step would be then just to make that pivot, to focus more investigations and more enforcement actions on allegations of online and platform-related fraud, deception, and unfair trade practices disproportionately affecting African Americans and people of color. So, promising things at the FTC. What we don't know, though, is whether the jurisdictional limitations of the FTC, right? Their trade practices, when their jurisdictional limitations will make them be able to really address the civil rights concerns that are at the bottom of the Black Opticon, and also whether future agency enforcement priorities will be the same as I think current ones seem to be. The future is somewhat uncertain, and of course, politics. The last area that I want to address is this proposed Federal Data Protection Act of 2021, and just to say a few words about how it might help to address the Black Opticon. Well, this exciting bill introduced by Senator Kristen Gillibrand, Democrat of New York, in the 117th Congress. This bill would create a federal data protection agency with three branches: a civil rights branch, a research branch, and a compliance communications branch. The Office of Civil Rights would ensure that the collection, processing, and sharing of personal data is fair, equitable, and non-discriminatory in treatment and effect. Bravo, right on. Doesn't mention Black people, could help Black people. The office would also aim at developing, establishing, and promoting data processing practices that affirmatively further equal opportunity and expand access to housing, employment, credit, insurance, education, healthcare, and other aspects of interstate commerce. And then finally, the office would coordinate the agency's civil rights efforts with other federal agencies and state regulators. This would be a phenomenal sea change in the way we think about and pursue privacy data protection in the United States, to have one of the main units of a federal agency focused on civil rights would be quite amazing. And we hope if they would focus on race-specific and group-specific civil rights problems. And I think by naming the problems, the Black Opticon, the equivalent in the Hispanic community, Native American community, et cetera, we would begin to enable more targeted remedies and approaches to addressing the problems that we're all facing. The research division would also, I think, further civil rights goals, because they would be charged with helping to identify and measure disparate impacts and privacy harms, right? We want to make sure that those neutral seeming laws are in fact not having a non-neutral impact. The complaint communication division would have its ear to the ground, and hopefully those grassroots concerns of African Americans could be heard at the highest levels of the federal government. Those are the good things, the positive things. The not so positive things, of course, are that passage of this bill is very unlikely. There are probably a dozen privacy bills pending in Congress right now. And this is the only one that has a privacy agency at its core. Most of them are simply sort of privacy bill of rights, fair information practice type bills on a national level. But I think it's going to be very unlikely it's passed. Now, it does, I think, have value as a model for what the law could aspire to, but we're not going to get this bill as currently written. And even if the agency did get created, its efficacy would be uncertain, because we don't know, how whether the bureaus that are and the units that are created to do all this good work would actually be able to do them in the long run, requiring the right expertise, the political will, et cetera. And then, I think that the future of any kind of privacy law in the United States has a big question mark on it. We've waited so long. We've been waiting for more than a decade for new privacy law. In fact, I think ever since the EU passed the data directive back in the 1990s, and then the GDPR a couple of years ago, we've been saying, America, you're overdue. Well, I think that there's a little bit of a cloud over this proposed Federal Data Protection Act because of the lack of movement so far, forward movement on a national level for privacy law in this country. So I want to just conclude by saying that there are some promising possibilities here, but the path forward is challenging. And it will require, I think, that we have race-conscious state and federal regulation in the interests of non-discrimination, anti-racism, anti-subordination. To be vague about what we're trying to do in the name of non-discrimination, I think it's not going to work. We have to really focus on what the problems are. The Black Opticon is one framework for really focusing our attention on what the problems are for one of America's most marginalized minority groups. Toward escaping the Black Opticon's prison of pernicious, biased, and watchful and attentiveness, African Americans and their allies are continuing the pursuit of viable strategies for justice, fairness, and equity in the digital economy. And as an example of this, I had a wonderful meeting just about a week ago with members of 3 or 4 different civil rights organizations and the Brookings Center, Brookings Institute, to talk about race and privacy and civil rights. The conversation is ongoing, and we're going to make some progress. Thank you very much. I look forward to our discussion. I look forward also to Professor Dixon Ramon's comments.
Thank you, Anita, for a really stimulating and fascinating talk and creating a very thought-provoking framework that I'm sure will engender discussion for years to come. We are happy to be the first people to have that discussion. We're privileged that you chose to debut your work here with us today. And I can't imagine anyone better positioned to offer those initial observations on the debut of your work than my friend and colleague, Ezekiel Dixon Ramon. Professor Dixon Ramon is on the member of the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania School of Public Social Policy and Practice. In addition to serving on the faculty, he's also the director of the school's master's program in social policy and is also the chair of the Data Analytics for Social Policy Certificate Program. So his work has been deeply informed by the way organizations use data, and particularly as they affect communities. In fact, it is my privilege to be a co-organizer with Professor Dixon Roman of Penn's AlgoWatch initiative that is studying ways to identify and correct bias in algorithmic decision-making. He is an expert in critical perspectives, particularly from the standpoint of race, which makes him, in my mind, the ideal commentator to this moment. And so without further ado, I turn it over to your capable hands to give us the hottest first take on this brand new framework of thinking about privacy and race.
Thank you, Christopher, for a beautiful introduction and also for building up anticipation, especially after following Anita Allen's absolutely brilliant and impressive paper. So I'd like to begin by extending my appreciation to Center for Technology, Innovation and Competition, the Penn Program on Regulation, and the Office of Equity and Inclusion at Penn Law, including Carrie Coglianesi and Christopher, yourself as well, for hosting the event and featuring Anita Allen's important work. I'd also like to extend my profound appreciation to Anita Allen for this timely and extremely important contribution. I was already humbled to be invited to comment on her paper today, as I've long been very fond of both Anita Allen's model leadership and scholarship. But as I read this essay, I became a student, learning through her various arguments, interventions, development of an absolutely timely question, sharp theoretical development and applications to excellent examples of existing and proposed policies, and how she lays out the concerns for this data privacy and equity as a new civil rights. Thus, thank you, Anita. Let me now turn to my comments today by turning first to what I read Anita Allen's paper to be up to. Dismantling the Black Opticon intervenes intervenes into both an existing and reconfigured discourse on data privacy and ethics. These political and policy discourses go back several decades, some of which were the focus of practices of psychological testing and employment and school admissions, as she notes in her paper. I'm quite familiar with this literature and line of policy and law because of my background in psychometrics. And I think it's of importance to note here, because of the policies that the policies that did not come about, or excuse me, that did come about, sorry, such as the Truth in Testing Act, were a result not of testing companies and organizations pushing Congress for these regulations, but rather from the public, on the ground movements, research from the scholarly research community, and nonprofits, as well as policymakers that heard and recognized issues and importance of developing legislation to address the reproduced inequalities and inequities of practices of testing. I note this in part because I think it's necessary to recognize that we should not expect big tech to push such necessary ethical practices or have a necessary focus on equity, let alone race as Anita's paper calls for. With the bottom line of profit, the assumed practices and decision-making of the ethical quickly become subsumed by interest and capital. As Anita rightly points out, African Americans and racially marginalized groups are often inequitably affected by such technosocial systems, practices, and designs. It is in part these sorts of racialized structures that play out in the design and practices of technologies and data infrastructures that lead to the recursion of the hierarchizing forces of racial capitalism. To fully account for the racialized surveilling structures of the data, Anita develops what she calls Black Opticon. This is a play on Jeremy Bentham's concept and architectural design of panopticon of surveillance that I will discuss later. She discusses Black Opticon in three modes, or might say dimensions or processes. The first is panopticon, or a focus specifically on discriminatory over-surveillance, on the discriminatory over-surveillance of African Americans. The second is ban opticon, or the data practices that lead to the exclusion of African Americans. And the third is con opticon, or predation, based on the targeting of African Americans that are financially vulnerable to con jobs that will exploit them of their already limited resources. Each of these she situates in concern related to data privacy and the lack of regulations to help protect African Americans and other groups that may be precarious to such conditions. Throughout the essay, she sharply teaches us how privacy policies have such great implications for enabling or regulating discriminatory, exclusionary, and predatory online practices. Based on her development of the Black Opticon, Anita then offers a way to legally address these concerns. She calls an African-American online equity agenda. She argues that existing and developing policies do not go far enough to protect the rights of African Americans online. She asserts that what's needed is a race-conscious, anti-racist focus to developing and designing of law and policy. She posits this would bring about, one, racial inequality, a racial inequality non-exacerbation goal, which would seek to address the likely inequality in data protection and privacy laws. Two, a racial impact neutrality goal that acknowledges that race-neutral privacy policies may not have race-neutral effects. Three, a race-based discriminatory over surveillance elimination goal, which would disable an invasive and excessive surveillance monitoring, profiling, tracking, and identification of African Americans. And fourth, a race-based discriminatory fraud, deceit, and exploitation reduction goal, which would be aimed at reducing fraud, deceit, and exploitation scams targeting African American consumers. Each of these goals Anita lays out seeks to address each of the concerns and effects of the Black Opticon. She then sharply applies her framework to a few examples of existing and developing policies, evaluating and pointing out the ways in which they do and don't meet the goals of an African American online equity agenda. And finally, what's fundamentally needed, what potentially could push us forward to meeting that very agenda. Now, I'd like to offer some comments that would build upon Anita's timely and brilliant contribution. And I want to begin with some of the theories that that's in the backdrop of Anita Allen's framework, or the framework of the Black Opticon. As I stated above, Black Opticon is a play on Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. There are two things that are really important to point out here. First, Opticon refers to seeing or vision. Seeing or vision has long been part of the sensorial operations of power and surveillance. In fact, this can work by way of being seen and recognized for an opportunity or granted resource or influence in the decision-making processes of an institution. Or, as Anita is focusing on here, how being seen can make one subject to being disciplined and controlled, exploited, and excluded. This second important point is that the second important point is that Panopticon was an architectural structure that enabled power or the surveiller to be able to see all of the subjects in a prison. The structure was designed such that the facility was designed in a pentagon shape, where the prisoners existed on the perimeter of the structure, and the lookout was in the center, able to see the prisoners at all times. French philosopher Michel Foucault reworked this idea of panopticon to rethink surveillance and discipline as a form of power that is not in a physical structure, but social structures where imaginaries are constructed and arrangements of space are developed to make one think they are always being watched, seen, monitored, and surveilled. As such, the subject would be disciplined to comport themselves to the constituted norms and expectations of power at all times. Importantly, the belief is that one is being watched and surveilled all of the time, despite the discontinuity between institutions and spaces. Following Foucault's articulations of disciplinary societies, French philosopher Gilles Deleuze rethought Michel Foucault's disciplinary societies in order to account for the increasingly more networked societies that since World War II have begun to reconfigure beyond the organization of vast spaces of enclosure of disciplinary societies. In control societies, discipline is no longer based on the corporal disciplining and shaping of bodies via the awareness of the possibility of being visible by authorities of surveillance. Control societies are characterized by the hypervisibility across time and space and the regulating of movement and acts via digital technologies such as mobile phones, platform participation, or algorithmic mechanisms. As Deleuze states, in control societies, quote, the numerical language of control is made of codes that mark access to information or reject it. The focus in control societies is not on the individual, but only parts and parcels or tensors, if you will, of the individual, such as a heart rate, or like when we'd like on a post, or a test score. Borrowing from William Burroughs, Deleuze's conception of control is not about influence or restraint, but rather a logic, or following Alex Galloway, a protocol that gives the impression of freedom, while one's choices and behaviors are modulated and generatively shaped for them. While Deleuze theorized that control societies will increasingly become the dominant logic of systems of governance, others have recently argued that sovereign, discipline, and control technologies of capture are enmeshed, and to think of them separately and teleologically may obscure the nuances of power. There is also, importantly, what Simone Brown has argued in her work in Dark Matter on the surveillance of Blackness. Surveillance has long been a technology that was built on and for the interest disciplining and controlling Black bodies, as it can be traced back to the violent global project of colonial capitalism. All of this is important in thinking through Anita Allen's Black Opticon. What Simone Brown's work points us to are the ways in which the development of surveillance practices are the logics of raciality and the interests of disciplining and controlling Black bodies, what the Black Opticon focuses on. This can also be traced to what Shoshana Magnet has pointed out in her work on biometrics, and how biometric technologies have always been first beta tested on vulnerable populations of Black and Brown folk in prisons. The next phase of development has often been in social services, so subjects, the precarious subjects of social services of the state. Each of these precarious and each precarious population that I just referred to are disproportionately Black. All of this points to the importance of everything that Anita lays out, as well as what more needs to be addressed. As a basic question for Anita to consider, how does the optical focus of the Black Opticon address the other sensorial affects of on Black communities online? For instance, I'm struck by the recent example of sexual violence that was experienced by a researcher of the metaverse, where her female avatar was gang raped by 4 male avatars. It's only a matter of time when these acts become a racialized play, and that which is felt, such as anxieties, not just in and through the interactions of the metaverse that even go beyond the metaverse, or how the ways in which acts become racialized in and through what is heard or through the sound, and the ways in which that affectively becomes a target, or even shaping the subject's behaviors. This can be thought of in multiple different ways in online behavior, where it's not just that which is seen, it's also that which is heard and felt. I'm wondering the ways in which, how might we still or be constrained by getting at these processes of power and raciality in and through a focus on data and through a focus on data itself, and in particular, the optics of data, if you will. Given these theoretical articulations, what I want to point to are, on the one hand, what I additionally want to point to are, on the one hand, the important value of focusing on data, as well as the limits of focusing on data, and point to the equally as important necessity to focus on the process and logic of the system. While data privacy brings a necessary regulatory focus on various discriminatory, exclusionary, and predatory processes and practices of online practices, what is not addressed are the defaults, assumptions, and epistemologies of the system. For instance, in work on facial recognition, what's often pointed to is the representation of the training data, of the training data set. But what's less often referred to in these analyses is the racialized history of hue in visual technologies and the calculative logics that were designed based on a logic of difference. This can also be thought of in relation to the oximeter technology for measuring oxygenation levels that uses infrared technologies that produce bias based on skin color. While oximeters are not necessarily thought of in online technologies, it's the measurements that may end up in online practices or online processes. I also would be remiss if I didn't note the various practices of misinformation that are being propelled by algorithmic processes. These are acts that have targeted specific groups with content that seeks to shape social and political behaviors. In focusing on the data, we might miss how the logic and predictive functions of the algorithm, in fact, enable the effect of these algorithmic misinformation campaigns to focus on and target those on social media most likely to interact with and be responsive to the content of these ads. And of course, this is done specifically by a particular algorithmic process of actually predicting who's most likely to interact. In both 2016 and 2020, misinformation campaigns were deployed to restrain or to constrain the Black vote, structuring an algorithmic form, a potential algorithmic form of political disenfranchisement. Thus, there is also a need to focus on, I would argue, the process and the logic of platforms and algorithmic systems, and the ways in which racial logics are not only in the data, but constituted in the defaults, assumptions, and epistemologies of the system. Thus, I want to assert that in addition to what Anita Allen has so brilliantly offered us here today, there is a need to include supported and focused research on the internal structures of algorithmic systems, the development of algorithmic auditing and accountability systems, regulations on what types of algorithms can be employed to inform what types of decision-making, and what forms of decision-making should not be even algorithmic, just to name a few. These additional potential measures need to be better developed in order to build onto the strong foundation that Anita Allen has sharply offered us today. And with that, I'm gonna end my comments, and I just wanna say thank you, Anita, for the opportunity to comment on your work and for this timely and such important contribution.
Well, thank you, Professor Dixon Roman, for Ezekiel, for giving us an important perspective and reaction to Anita's work. So, Professor Allen, I would love to give you a few minutes to reflect or respond to anything that Professor Dixon Roman has said, or any further thoughts you might have about your work.
Thank you. I really appreciate the very succinct summary that Professor Dixon Moran provided for the essay. It was very thoughtful and very good. I hope the audience who were taking notes can benefit from that. But I wanted to say how much I appreciate your comments beyond the building on, as you said, you want to build on. You said my essay, and I think that you built on in some very important ways. The Foucault and the implications of Foucault. I am a student of Foucault. His name does not appear in this essay. Many people are surprised that I hark back to Bentham instead of harking less back to this 20th century scholars who contributed to the Black Opticon. It's implicit in what I say, but it's not explicit. I think that you make a good point in pointing out that maybe by bringing into focus some of the scholarly contributions that build on Bentham through Foucault, I would actually have a richer theoretical framework for the discussion. I am hoping, Professor, to write a book, and it will fit nicely into this more expansive space. As you know, law reviews have their limitations. Secondly, I want to say that I love the point about moving to the sensorial beyond the optic. And I have thought about in a somewhat different way that I think than you're urging that we think about it. I think you're absolutely right that we shouldn't just limit ourselves to everything that can be framed as a problem of seeing or being seen. What about being heard? What about being felt? What about being smelled? All those things too. So I just wanted to mention that I'm very interested in offline versions of that problem. You mentioned what do we do when, in the metaverse, people are raped? Well, we had that problem discussed back in the 90s, right? It was that we were discussing the fact that people would create avatars and living in little, My Tiny Life worlds, and things would happen to them. They would feel them as if they had happened to them in the non-virtual world. It was a rape was a rape was a rape. Some people couldn't understand how an avatar's assault could be a serious thing, but other people saw how much we identify with the avatars we create and through which we interact online. And it becomes more. But anyway, putting that aside, example of the kind of thing I'm interested in. There was a situation down in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University, where a physician named Nikita Levy had been for years making videos of his OBGYN patients by having little spy pens hidden in his pockets and in his office. And so he was using the videos as essentially pornography. And when he was eventually caught and arrested, the police discovered an entire bank of computers in his basement. He was apparently sort of serving up OBGYN porn. Well, the vast majority of his patients were Black women. I was asked by a law firm to go down to Baltimore to meet with some of the victims of Dr. Nikita, who, by the way, was so upset when he was caught, he committed suicide right away. But anyway, I went down to Baltimore to meet. I've never been in a room of women who were more devastated. To have given their confidence and trust to a doctor for so many years and discover he was actually abusing them, that he was in a sense raping them, right? They were heartbroken. That lawsuits did ensue, and they were settled relatively recently. But that's the kind of thing I'm not just interested. I'm not just interested in data, and I'm just interested in surveillance, and that can be data issues can be sort of squeezed into the framework of data. What I'm interested in is privacy, interested in the many ways in which people in the online and the offline world experience assaults on their privacy. And when I went to talk to those women in Baltimore, I talked about their problem as one of privacy, the privacy of having their genitals and their breasts examined by somebody who's actually making porn out of them, and the privacy of having the police then look at all these videos, right, once the arrest was made, and then a further assault on their privacy that they felt, and they were horrified by that prospect as well. So yes, I'm going to think a lot more about your comment, because I would love to both address it exactly the way you put it. What about online, non-optic versions of privacy and data protection problems? But also, I want to continue my work on offline privacy in the literal non-virtual world, where I think there are many different kinds of privacy problems that people of color, including Black men and women, face that are under-narrated, under-attended. And then finally, I think you're absolutely right that the processes and the logic deserve a lot of attention. And I think that in my future work, I hope to more thoroughly address the concerns about the ways in which the very assumptions of what we're doing, right, need to be challenged. And you mentioned the idea of algorithmic audits as a process which might actually help to undercut some of the racism and defaults that may sneak into algorithms or be put there intentionally. I agree with all of that. Totally. So in short, I just want to say that I appreciate your push. I feel you as pushing me in a more theoretical direction, and in a particular theoretical direction, and expanding my vision beyond vision to other sensorial elements. So thank you very much for those lovely comments. And my work will be much better because of your helpful comments. I really appreciate the time you took, very much so. And I hope you'll give me a copy of your comments.
Well, thank you both very much. We would, as edifying as this exchange has been for both the participants and for all of us privileged to listen, we do have a number of questions in the queue. I will try to get to as many of them as possible, but I would like to pick a few of them out and present them to you, both to you, Professor Allen and Professor Dixon-Roman, as you see fit to answer. The first question involves basically the supposed tensions with free speech, to introduce it generally. Paraphrasing a bit, one person asks, your introduction suggested strongly that free speech rights are somewhat antithetical to equity and minority rights, specifically that big tech prioritized the former over the latter. Given the generation of civil rights and racial justice activists have fought and relied on free speech protections, can you explain why you think that? Interestingly, I will add my own gloss. Often speech and privacy are seen as being in tension with one another. And what extent does free speech exist in tension with privacy and race, and the intersection of privacy and race that you're identifying and calling so eloquently to our attention today, Professor Allen, and thoughts, Professor Dixon-Roman?
Well, we have many situations in which the free speech of some results in harm and offense to others. It's a common problem. Sometimes the people to whom the offense and harm, on whom that falls, happen to be African American. So there is free speech hurts, and it's a problem we have to negotiate as a society. And I was not suggesting or intending to suggest that we always have to prefer the concerns about equity and inclusion that African Americans represent over free speech, or the opposite. I think that we have to find some appropriate ways to accommodate our precious values of free speech and our precious values of respect for others, civility, and equity. That's my response to that concern.
I'm going to leave it to the expert on this one. It's a great question, though.
So there's other questions here, and I'm going to actually pair two of them together because I think they make a fascinating perspective. One question asks, you mentioned over surveillance of economically disadvantaged people by governmental agencies. Such agencies may justify their collection of data by citing positive goals, such as program evaluation or targeting benefits to those in most need. Can you elaborate on your concept of over-surveillance or suggest further reading on this topic? On the other hand, another questioner asks, I noticed the agenda advocates for the elimination of discriminatory surveillance, but only for the reduction of discriminatory surveillance reduction of discriminatory exclusion and fraud and deceit. Is this because you anticipate that discriminatory exclusion and fraud will be more difficult to tackle than discriminatory surveillance? Perhaps because these actions are more often perpetrated by private entities than the government. So I take this pair of questions as asking for some comparative assessments about the roles of government surveillance versus surveillance by private entities. The questions about the differences between exclusion and surveillance and how they are different, and an invitation to find a middle ground, because entering into this world suggests there's many different graduations of responses that may exist in some tension with some other goals we may have. And so I think generally these two questions invite a broader discussion of how we can engage into some of those gray areas where some of these things are not as clear, both in terms of harm or remediability.
So one of my concerns that is implicit in this paper, and to some extent explicit in this paper, is the concern about finding that middle ground. And my concern is that in our society, too often, finding the middle ground is not really finding the middle ground. Finding the middle ground is finding a compromise that satisfies some people, but may still not satisfy the needs and interests of all people equally, or that may marginalize some people in trying to seek that compromise or that quote unquote balance. I think it's very common for African Americans to be on the short stick of the compromises and the balances that our society comes to in trying to reconcile competing goals and interests. So I just want to put that out there. And it's kind of a critical race theory kind of a concern that these sort of mainstream approaches to find the common ground or the neutral principle, that all this sort of thinking is actually not necessarily going to ever get to the heart of the matter for African Americans, which is to really undo the trauma of slavery and racially enforced segregation. So I'm gonna today just be a little bit of a critical race theorist and say I'm a little skeptical about the finding the middle ground, if that means finding what's politically acceptable to a mainstream majority. But I want to also say that over surveillance can be conducted by private sector and by public sector. It can be conducted by people with good intentions and evil intentions. Surveillance as per se is not necessarily either good or bad. It's what the surveillance is doing, and how much surveillance needs to be done depends upon the context. That's my view. So I would never advocate an end to all surveillance. That would be stupid, right? We have to find forms of surveillance that actually are respectful of the legitimate claims and interests of our polity, that is in an inclusive way. So for example, putting up cameras in housing projects where people of color live, right, is a kind of surveillance that it has a very beneficial goal. It makes the neighborhood safer. It gives people, it allows the police to investigate and solve crimes, and it deters wrongdoing. Right, and all those things are sort of true. It doesn't mean that the privacy interests people have who live in housing projects will allow the degree of surveillance that may have good purposes. The thing is, what do you think privacy is? Is it a fundamental right that acts as a trump against utilitarian purposes sometimes? Or is it always just another factor to be weighed and balanced in the weighing and balancing? So I think it's important that to sort of connect the concerns about minorities and people of color with concerns about what is the nature of privacy? Is it something which is always subject to balancing, or is it something that is sometimes a trump? So even if we could achieve good public purposes or good private purposes, we don't do those things because doing it would adversely impact people's privacy to an extent we just cannot tolerate as a free society. So I just want to say that I try to avoid sort of locking myself into these sort of perpetual battles between surveillance or non-surveillance or free speech or privacy, because I think that we have to negotiate this terrain, but we have to negotiate it in a way that doesn't always put people of color on the bottom, right? And we have to figure out a way to do that. That's really what I'm all about in this paper, trying to say that as we're trying to find solutions to our common problems, that we don't push aside literally the marginalized, but rather we try to center to a great extent the concerns of the marginalized groups, and to take their interest and needs as they understand them, as we understand them, fully into account, and then see what kind of a society we end up with, what kind of schools we end up with, and what kind of online platforms we end up with when we have really truly taken everyone's interest to heart and taken it into account.
I just want to add a couple more things onto what Anita just shared. I mean, I think one might think about the ways in which over-surveillance is playing out with regard to administrative data. Who is often the subject of administrative data when it comes to health, social service, Department of Health and Human Services, public schooling. It's not the elite. It's generally those that are either from middle, working class, or poor backgrounds. And then, of course, when it comes to criminal justice, who's most likely to be overrepresented are especially not just poor, but also Black and brown bodies. And so I think there's a way in which we have to think about how over surveillance is playing out just in the collection of data in all these administrative data systems that can be understood in a kind of over surveillance. Additionally, racial profiling is another one, in the ways in which it even plays out in online policing practices as well. And then finally, also social service increasingly engaging in surveillance practices. So Anita nicely mentioned the example of camera being used, and even in the instance, an example of projects in Brooklyn that attempt to try to use facial recognition to even enter the project buildings, but also even monitoring their online practices and behaviors. And then the last thing I'll mention, last thing I'll mention on this point is labor and employment, and the ways in which labor and employment is increasingly looking at online profiles, whether it's Facebook and other things. And so who is the subject of that is the ones who are of the working class especially. But the last thing I want to say is that there was this question, as I understood, of the distinction between surveillance and discrimination. And I would say discrimination really is a product of surveillance. Discrimination necessitates surveillance. But in fact, discrimination is very much so a force of power that is constituting who is the subject to be excluded and who's to be included.
You know, Christopher, as I was listening to Ezekiel, I remembered an example from the community you and I live in the same town. The parents in this wealthy Philadelphia suburb brought a lawsuit. Some of the Black parents brought a lawsuit against the school system. The school system wanted to share anonymized school records of the children in the school district in order to help improve the programs that were available to students of color. The parents didn't want that, and they brought a lawsuit, and they alleged privacy invasion. And sometimes I think it's hard to understand how people of color view using the group's information, even if it's not particularized or identifiable, using the group's information might be, in the group's mind, harming the group or placing the group at risk. That's a kind of a privacy issue that I think we should think about more when we think about privacy through the lens of race. That some of the conventional understandings of what it means to have an interest in privacy, some of the conventional understandings of what it means to use synonymous or anonymized data, they just don't apply to the actual lived experiences and thinking of people of color. Native Americans don't think about privacy the same way white people do. Black people don't think about privacy the same way white people do in every instance. And we're seeing it not just in theory or in sociology, but we're seeing it in practice. Read the law books. You see people bringing lawsuits where other people are saying, "Oh, what could be the possible reason for that?" So we have a lot of work to do, I think, in understanding surveillance, over surveillance, discriminatory surveillance versus non-discriminatory surveillance. And I'm fascinated by these problems. It's been a lifetime of effort on my part to get clear about privacy, and I'm delighted to finally be focusing on this very difficult set of issues around race and privacy.
We are almost at the end, but I will give the courtesy of the last question I read to one submitted by our colleague, Tobias Wolff. What are the implications of the Black Opticon for the ways in which people curate their identities and data in online spaces? Do you see or foresee strategies of resistance among people who are the targets of these discriminatory practices, particularly when legal or corporate interventions prove inadequate? And there's another question touching on this is, people, when those interventions are available, do not seem to be availing themselves of them often. How do we explain this, and how should we think about possible responses or lack of responses?
Yeah, thank you, Tobias. It's a great question. Curating an identity in the context of the Black Opticon, what sort of identities would one seek to form given the Black Opticon, especially if one is a person who's Black or in a wheelchair or gay or Hispanic or Native American or some other group that faces these kinds of concerns about special vulnerabilities. How would you curate your identity? And I think that the metaverse issue that came up before is an interesting one because it will allow people to, even though the Black Opticon will still be there, to curate identities through avatars that might be more comfortable for them to then engage in the world with others. And I though view this as somewhat sad, and I think something will be lost, right? If we transform ourselves through curated avatar type beings who operate with others in a metaverse. I think that we should celebrate our differences and our particularities, even though those particularities may cause us considerable pain and put us in harm's way. I'm not eager to see us move away from our identities in order to be safer or even to be more acceptable to others. Naturally, of course, we want to use the resources of pseudonymity and anonymity and avatars to protect ourselves from the most serious forms of harm when we can. But there's a certain loss there that I think I'm worried about, Tobias, and I'd love to have a conversation with you at some point about that. But curating identities within I think Black people do it already, right? There are ways in which, knowing that we could be conned, knowing that we could be excluded, knowing that we could be surveilled, we may alter our behavior and make ourselves seem more acceptable, less deviant, less mainstream, more mainstream, less deviant than we actually are, in order to be comfortable and to be not harmed by the all-seeing eye of the Black Opticon. We may try to conceal our identity so that we won't be on the short end when it comes to getting a loan or getting a house. We may use our white voice and not our Black voice in talking to people, on FaceTime, not FaceTime, on WhatsApp. And then when it comes to we do curate identities all the time in order to negotiate the Black Opticon and its equivalent cons, right? I think people who have any reason to think that they'll be excluded or attacked by virtue of who they are will begin to curate their identities. Why people don't use more of the resources for identity curation, I think it has something to do with the same reason people don't use more of the resources available for just routine online protection. And why didn't people use encryption? Why didn't people take advantage of the opportunity to have non-identifying identities on social media? I think in some ways we like being who we are and we like being in the world as what we are, but also the technology isn't easy. And sometimes just accessing and utilizing the technologies that will allow us to curate our identities is overwhelming. And so people just sort of throw their hands up and say, I'm Anita Allen, I'm not, I'm not, and I'm, so that I think that's the issue, that technology is hard, it's expensive, and it's also a little bit undesirable, because I think people do, to some extent, want to be who they are authentically online as well as offline.
Is there time for me to give a brief comment, or
briefly, if you would?
Kenny, please.
So in Anita, in your paper, you have a great example that you give of Black Lives Matter protesters being surveilled by the police using they're using facial recognition technology and all. I want to sort of in the example of strategies of resistance, there's also Black technologists who are developing subversive practices, and especially apparel, to work against the logics of the system itself. So understanding the logics of facial recognition, developing apparel so that protesters can maneuver without being identified. So for example, like a piece of a sweatshirt that has a bunch of faces on it that then disrupts the logic of facial recognition. I think there's so many more examples of this and so many more potentialities that I think really we should be pointing to and also in thinking about and developing further.
Yeah, lovely point.
Well, thank you. I wish we could go on and on, and with apologies to those who asked questions which we were unable to reach, I would like to call the program to an end with our deep thanks for all the participants for coming today, but especially to you, Professor Allen, and for your thought-provoking work around which this is based, and you, Professor Dixon Roman, for providing wonderful commentary and insightful analysis. We are delighted to have you here. On behalf of the Center for Technology Innovation and Competition and Professor Colonese and the Penn Program on Regulation, would like to declare this event to concluded, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.